The pain arrived before consciousness did. It lived in his joints, tightened around his chest like a rigid hoop, and throbbed in his temples. He opened his eyes. The ceiling slowly emerged from the gray haze. The noise of the air conditioner cut through his hearing with a monotonous hum. He tried to take a deep breath. The air whistled through his parched throat, but it felt as if it never reached his lungs. The pile of flesh that he called his body pinned him to the mattress. 800 pounds. The number from his last weigh-in at the doctor's office pulsed in his head. 800. It was not just a weight, it was a death sentence. He lay on his back, staring at the gray plastic of the ceiling panels. His arms were spread wide, and his fingers were swollen, resembling sausages. He needed to get up. That thought came every morning, and every time it seemed like an impossible task that demanded the mobilization of all his resources. He made a sudden jerk. His abdominal muscles, hidden beneath layers of fat, tried to contract. Nothing happened. There was only a trail of dull pain from his ribs to his groin. He growled, hoarsely and weakly. He made a second attempt and turned onto his side. The bed creaked pitifully. His center of gravity shifted, and he found himself on the edge. He had to lower his legs. He needed to feel the cold floor with his ugly feet, which were swollen with bulging veins. It was done. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, as if he had just run a marathon. Sweat had already broken out on his forehead in fine beads. The room drowned in twilight because the curtains were drawn shut. He hated the daylight. The light showed the truth. The light revealed the pizza boxes scattered on the floor, the empty cardboard containers from Chinese noodles, and the crumpled plastic bottles. He looked at his hands. He looked at the folds of fat hanging over his knees. A dull, familiar hatred awoke inside him. It was not toward the world, but toward himself. He hated this slab of meat that consumed his personality day after day. On the nightstand beside him, his smartphone screen lit up. It was a delivery notification. The app remembered his habits better than he did himself. He usually ordered 3 pepperoni pizzas, a 2-liter bottle of cola, and spicy chicken wings. They were large portions. He always ordered large portions. His finger hovered over the screen. Yesterday, he had promised himself that this was the end. Last night, writhing from heartburn and a heavy stomach, he had sworn to start over. He would start on Monday. He would start tomorrow. Now it was that very tomorrow, and he wanted to gorge. The hunger twisted his insides, demanding its due. It was not a physical hunger, and it was not a need for calories. He had enough calories in him to feed a platoon of soldiers. It was a void. A black hole existed inside him that could only be plugged with food. He pressed the reorder button. He confirmed it. He paid for it. The screen went dark. He lowered his head again, breathing heavily. He was surrendering his position. It was another defeat. He knew the taste of this failure. It carried the taste of barbecue sauce and cheap cheese. He needed to use the bathroom. Walking to the door meant taking 10 steps. For him, it was a marathon. He planted his hands on the edge of the bed. He tensed his arms. His legs trembled under their unnatural weight. His knees cracked. He stood up. The world swayed for a second, and black spots swam before his eyes. He waited out the dizziness, leaning heavily against the wall. He took a step. Then he took another step. His back ached constantly. The discs of his spine were compressed, flattened under the burden of his mass. He dragged his legs, heavily shifting his weight from one to the other. His breathing turned into a wheeze. In the bathroom, he avoided looking into the mirror above the sink. He knew what he would see there. He would see a swollen face with 3 chins, puffy little eyes, and gray, unhealthy skin. He washed his face with cold water. He wiped his face with a stale towel. He returned to the room. The process took about 10 minutes, but he felt completely drained. He collapsed back onto the bed. The springs responded with a long groan. His smartphone rang. It was the courier. "Leave it at the door," he barked hoarsely into the receiver, not even waiting for an answer. He didn't want to see anyone. He especially hated seeing couriers. He knew those looks of theirs. They were always hiding disgust, trying not to linger on him longer than necessary. He waited until the footsteps on the staircase faded away. He stood up again. The ritual repeated. Pain, tension, and steps. He opened the door. He grabbed the bags. They smelled maddeningly of fried dough, meat, and spices. Saliva instantly flooded his mouth. He placed the boxes on the bed. He sat down next to them. He opened the first pizza. The yellow cheese bubbled, covered with orange islands of grease. He took a slice. His hands shook. He took a bite. The hot cheese burned his palate, and the taste of sausage, salt, and dough hit his receptors. His eyes closed on their own. For a second, for one brief moment, he felt better. The void inside him retreated. He ate a second slice, then a third. He ate greedily, quickly, barely chewing. He washed it down with cola straight from the bottle, ignoring the glasses entirely. The carbon dioxide burned his throat, but he only swallowed faster. The first box was empty. He opened the second box. By the middle of the third pizza, satiety arrived. It felt mechanical and heavy. His stomach stretched, sending distress signals. A pressure built up beneath his ribs. He kicked the empty box onto the floor. He wiped his greasy hands on the bedsheet. He lay on his back. Breathing became even harder. The food sat like a hard lump in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, pumping thick blood through miles of veins hidden under the fat. He stared at the ceiling. I am no longer living. I am merely existing. That thought crystallized in his brain, clearly, coldly, without the slightest trace of self-pity. It was a statement of fact, a medical diagnosis. He was a biological mechanism working to maintain its own mass. There was no meaning. There was no future. There was only the next food order. And there was pain. Tomorrow, the exact same thing would repeat. It would happen the day after tomorrow, too. It would continue until his heart stopped, unable to bear the strain. He waited for that. Secretly, somewhere at the very bottom of his soul, he wished it would happen sooner. He wanted it to happen in his sleep. He wanted to simply not wake up. He wanted to simply stop feeling the pain in his joints, the disgust for his reflection, and the endless sucking hunger. But his organism proved resilient. It clung to life with the stubbornness of a parasite. His cell phone chimed, announcing a new message. He turned his head. His brother's number was glowing on the screen. It was another attempt to drag him out of the swamp. It was another lecture disguised as care. He didn't read it. He turned away. The room grew quiet again. Only his heavy, wheezing breath and the hum of the air conditioner measured the time draining into nowhere. Evening arrived unnoticed. The sunlight filtering through the gaps in the blinds was replaced by the orange glow of street lamps. Nothing had changed. He lay there, digesting what he had eaten, fighting nausea and heartburn. His body sweated, and the synthetic fabric of his t-shirt clung to his skin, irritating it constantly. He tried to sit up. With great effort, he peeled his back off the damp bedsheet. He needed to take a shower, but the thought of a trip to the bathroom provoked an internal protest. It meant getting up again. It meant dragging the weight of his flesh again. He would have to get undressed. He would see those folds of fat. Standing in the shower, suffocating from the steam, and trying to reach his back with a loofah was an almost impossible task. He abandoned the idea. He remained seated, hunched over heavily. His stomach rested on his thighs. Why had he become like this? He used to look for answers. He dug into childhood traumas, stress at work, and a failed marriage that had ended before his weight had crossed the 400-pound mark. He looked for people to blame. He blamed doctors, genetics, and food corporations hooking people on sugar and MSG. Now, he didn't care. The answer didn't matter when the result was right before his eyes. He had lost this battle. He lost banally, without any pathos or heroism. He simply gave up, letting weakness take the upper hand. Every new pound was like a layer of insulation separating him from the world. Now, the layer had become impenetrable. It became his armor, a sarcophagus. In the corner of the room, the refrigerator buzzed. Inside were prepackaged meals, beer, and frozen nuggets. They served as a reserve fund in case the delivery was delayed or a panic attack about running out of food rolled over him in the night. He reached out, groping for the TV remote. The buttons were sticky from sweet soda spilled long ago. He pressed harder. The screen blinked, bathing the room in a cold, bluish light. It was some talk show. People in expensive suits yelled at each other, discussing problems that seemed absolutely ridiculous to him in his condition, as distant as life on Mars. He turned the volume down to the minimum. He left only the picture on, so he wouldn't go crazy in total emptiness. The doorbell shattered the monotony of the evening. It was sharp and demanding. He flinched. He hadn't ordered anything. The delivery had been in the morning. Maybe it was the neighbors? Or perhaps someone got the wrong floor. He decided not to open it. He pretended he wasn't home. The ring repeated. It was long and continuous. Someone was pressing the button and holding it down. He groaned. He had to get up. The lifting procedure went a little easier than in the morning because his muscles had loosened up a bit, but his shortness of breath returned instantly. He hobbled into the hallway. He looked through the peephole. His brother stood on the landing. It was Mark. He was dressed impeccably, toned, radiating confidence and energy, the exact opposite of the man looking at him from inside the apartment. He slowly turned the lock handle. The door creaked on its hinges and opened slightly. Mark didn't wait for an invitation. He squeezed inside, pushing him aside. Mark's gaze instantly scanned the hallway, caught sight of the mountain of uncollected trash, and registered the stale, sour smell of an unwashed body and old food. Mark grimaced, but said nothing. "Hello," Mark said, taking off his jacket and tossing it onto an ottoman that threatened to fall apart from old age. "I called. You didn't answer." "My phone is on silent," he lied, closing the door. Speaking was difficult. His voice had grown hoarse from silence and the fat compressing his throat. Mark walked into the room. He ran his eyes over the pizza boxes on the bed and the empty bottles on the floor. "Again?" Mark asked. He didn't speak with anger, but with weariness. He didn't answer. He silently returned to the bed and sank heavily onto the edge. "I didn't come here to lecture you." Mark remained standing in the middle of the room. He didn't cross his arms or strike a self-righteous pose. He just looked at his brother. For a long time, he just assessed him. "Then why did you come?" Mark pulled a piece of paper, folded in 4, from his pants pocket. He tossed it onto the bed next to a sauce stain. "I found an option," Mark said curtly. He glanced sideways at the paper. The text was printed in small type. It showed a clinic's logo. The address was on the outskirts of the city. More charlatans with magic pills. Next door, right around the corner, hypnotists, acupuncture. I've tried it all, Mark. You know that. "This is different," Mark said, stepping closer. His face was serious, even harsh. "It's a closed facility, no advertising. They don't take everyone. They only take the hopeless cases. Like you." "How much?" He let out a half smile with one corner of his mouth. "How much does it cost this time?" "For you? Nothing. I'll pay for the treatment. It's an investment. Or call it whatever you want." He looked at his brother. There was always an ulterior motive behind this generosity. "What's the catch?" "The conditions are strict." Mark didn't break eye contact and spoke his words slowly, emphasizing each one. "First, you sign a contract. Then you find out the method. You can't back out in the middle of the process. I won't be able to take you out of there until you complete the contract's terms, or until they discharge you themselves." He scoffed, heavily lifting his hand and rubbing his forehead. "It smells like a cult. Or slavery." "Maybe. But the guy who gave me this contact weighed close to 400 pounds. I saw him last week. He weighs 200 pounds. He's a healthy, mean, jacked bastard now. He works like a machine." "And he didn't tell you what they do there?" "He refused. He said it was part of the contract deal. Silence." Quiet settled over the room. The hum of the air conditioner came to the forefront again. He looked at the piece of paper. The Last Chance. It was a cliché name, a cheap one. "You do realize you'll be dead soon, right?" Mark asked quietly. "You have another 6 months, a year at most. Your heart won't take it. Your liver will give out. You'll simply stop. And I'll have to pay for a reinforced coffin and 2 burial plots for you." It was the truth. It was bare and naked. He knew it himself. "Yeah," he wheezed. "So you have nothing to lose. Pack your things. A car will pick you up tomorrow morning." Mark didn't wait for an answer. He turned around, grabbed his jacket from the ottoman, and walked out. The front door slammed in the hallway. He was left alone. He was alone again. He picked up the piece of paper. He skimmed the lines. It was for the Last Chance Clinic. It contained an agreement for voluntary participation in an experimental program. It included a waiver of claims and consent to the use of unknown medical and psychological practices. He tossed the paper back onto the bed. The conditions were strange. To sign without knowing the method, to waive the right to stop. A normal person would have told all this to go to hell. A normal person who had a job, a family, and weekend plans would reject it. Someone who had a life would reject it. He didn't have a life. He had an existence from one food delivery to the next. He suffered from a third chin, shortness of breath, and purulent sores in the folds of his fat, that he had to sprinkle with baby powder. He had pain. Constant pain throbbed in his back and knees. He looked at his hands. They were swollen sausage fingers. His gaze fell on the half-eaten slice of pizza in the box. The congealed cheese looked like hardened plastic. He had nothing to lose. Mark was right. This wasn't a risk. It was a statement of fact. It couldn't get any worse. Because worse meant only death. And death was approaching with every passing minute. He scoffed. He could imagine his death. He saw doctors trying to shove an oxygen tube down his throat and stretchers buckling under his weight. And here, they were offering something else. It couldn't get worse. He reached for the nightstand and fumbled for a pen. He placed the paper on the pizza box, using it as a clipboard, and smoothed out the creases in the paper. The ballpoint pen left a greasy smudge on the page. Dirty fingers. He signed his name with a sweeping motion at the bottom of the page. He agreed. I am no longer living. I am merely existing. Let them do whatever they want. Sleep evaded him. The night dragged on as slowly as thick syrup. He lay with his eyes open, listening to the sounds of the waking city. A street sweeper drove past outside the window, loudly dumping water onto the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed. He imagined the paramedics trying to lift his massive carcass. The image only elicited a crooked smile. By morning, resolve had built up. Or rather, a dull apathy had reached the point where any action seemed less painful than inaction. He packed a bag. It wasn't hard. He took a few oversized t-shirts, sweatpants with elastic waistbands, and sneakers that he put on with the aid of a long shoehorn, grunting and dripping with sweat. He packed toiletries. He added baby powder for the folds of his skin. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily after the physical exertion. He waited. There was still no fear. He felt like cattle in a truck heading to the slaughterhouse. What difference did it make what lay behind the doors of that slaughterhouse? At exactly 10 o'clock sharp, a quiet knock on the door sounded. There was none of the insistent ringing like his brother's yesterday. There were 2 short, dry raps on the wood. He stood up and grabbed the handle of his bag. It felt incredibly heavy, even though it contained only a few pounds of belongings. He walked to the hallway and unlocked the door. 2 men stood on the landing. They were fit, lean guys in identical dark gray suits. They wore no name tags, no clinic logos, and no medical scrubs. They had short haircuts and cold, attentive eyes. "Rudin?" one of them asked. His voice was flat and devoid of intonation. "Yes," he answered hoarsely, clearing his throat. "The contract is signed." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He handed over the folded sheet of paper. The one who had spoken took the paper, quickly checked the signature, and carefully tucked it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Not a single emotion showed on his face. They were professionals. "Your things?" the second escort asked, nodding at the duffel bag. "Yes, I packed the essentials." "You won't need them. Leave it here." He frowned, shifting his body weight to his other leg. His knee creaked in warning. "There's soap in here, deodorant, powder, and a change of clothes. The facility provides everything you need, strictly according to the patient intake protocol." The first one snapped precisely. "Leave the bag." He didn't have the strength to argue. He simply unclasped his fingers. The bag thumped dully against the linoleum in the hallway. "Exit." They didn't rush him as he descended the stairs. The elevator had been out of order for a week. The steps came at the cost of blood-spilling effort. He gripped the wooden railing with a sweaty hand, pulling his massive body along. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of his own footsteps. The two escorts simply followed behind. They didn't help. They didn't offer a shoulder to lean on. They maintained their distance like prison guards. In the courtyard, right outside the apartment building entrance, stood an inconspicuous black minivan with heavily tinted windows. The door obediently slid aside, revealing a gloomy interior. Board the vehicle. He struggled to squeeze inside and collapsed onto the back seat. It turned out to be hard, covered in smooth, synthetic material. It didn't smell like a pine air freshener inside. Rather, it smelled like something sterile, similar to a surgical room. One of the escorts sat next to him, cutting off his access to the door. The second man slipped behind the steering wheel. The door slammed shut with a dull thud, locking out the street noise. The air conditioner clicked on, blasting him with cold air. The vehicle drove off smoothly. He looked out the window, but the heavy tint made the scenery look colorless. He saw the silhouettes of buildings, traffic lights, and gray boxes of shopping centers. Everything blurred into a murky ribbon. He made no attempt to memorize the route. There was no point. At least an hour passed. The urban sprawl gave way to industrial zones, and then to a dense wall of trees. The asphalt worsened, and the car began to shake slightly. The minivan stopped. Judging by the sounds, heavy metal gates were opening. The vehicle slowly rolled into the newly formed gap and stopped again. The driver killed the engine. The door slid open with a quiet buzz. "Get out." He tumbled out, grabbing onto the edge of the door frame. It was an underground garage. He saw bare concrete walls, the dim light of long fluorescent lamps, and smelled stagnant water and automotive chemicals. There were no fancy signs or welcoming faces of receptionists. There was only a steel door without a handle embedded in the concrete wall ahead. The escort stepped up to the door and pressed a key card against a hidden scanner. Something clicked inside the panel, and the heavy leaf slid into a slot with the hiss of pneumatics. "Straight down the hallway. Take a right at the very end." He heavily crossed the threshold. The air inside differed sharply from the garage. It was dry, sterile, and entirely odorless. The hallway was lined with white matte panels. There were no joints and no gaps. The light streamed directly from the ceiling, even and shadowless. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the silence. He slowly dragged himself forward, gasping for breath. At the end of the hallway, there was indeed a turn to the right. It was an open doorway. He walked inside. It was an empty room. There was only a rigid stainless steel examination table and a plastic stool in front of it. A clear plastic cup of water sat on the stool, resting next to a white square of paper. On the paper lay a single capsule-type pill. It was brightly colored in 2 tones. Behind him, noiselessly, like a blade slipping through butter, the hallway door closed. He was alone. The trap had shut. And then a voice rang out. It came from somewhere above, where no speakers were visible. It was an absolutely synthesized sound, entirely stripped of any human overtones. Initiation procedure. Ingest the medication. This is a mandatory condition of the contract. He approached the stool. He picked up the capsule. Was it poison? A sleeping pill? A narcotic? He had nothing to lose. He tossed the capsule into his mouth and washed it down with the water. The water was icy and distilled. His throat cramped. He sat on the examination table. The cold metal unpleasantly chilled his overheated back. The effect hit almost instantly, without warning. A high, nasty ringing started in his ears. The bright white light of the ceiling panels flickered and began to dim rapidly, condensing into a narrow spot. He tried to move his hand to lean against the edge of the table, but his muscles had turned to water. His body grew heavy, plunging into a black, viscous pit. His last coherent thought, before his consciousness finally flickered out, was a clear and cold realization. The door was closed. There was no turning back. The return was long. His consciousness surfaced from the viscous, suffocating darkness in jerks. First, his sense of touch returned. His back felt a hard, surgically flat surface instead of the rough foam of his home mattress. Then, his hearing came back. He heard a steady hum that sounded like the operation of powerful ventilation turbines. He opened his eyes. For a moment, the world blurred into a gray spot, and then it focused. He saw a white plastic ceiling. There were no lamps or light fixtures. The surface of the panels itself emitted the light. It was an even, shadowless glow that cut his eyes, which had grown unaccustomed to brightness. He tried to swallow. His mouth was so dry that it felt as if someone had poured sand into it. His tongue barely moved. His lips were cracked. He needed to get up. It was a familiar thought that demanded a familiar ritual. He had to engage his muscles, gather his willpower into a fist, and prepare for the pain in his spine. He tensed his abdominal muscles. He flinched. Something had changed. His body responded not with dull pain and the agonizing groans of fat-covered ligaments. It responded more lightly. It was not easy, no. The 800 pounds had not gone anywhere. Pressure crushed his chest, and the folds of fat still hung over the sides of the white hospital gown he was wearing. But the sensation of an unliftable, deadly weight, where every inch of movement required the expenditure of his last drop of energy, had vanished. He turned his head. The room was huge. No, it was not a room. It was a hall. He saw light plastic panels on the walls. The smooth floor lacked a single seam. There was vast, open space. There were no windows and no doors in the traditional sense. Somewhere, far away, about 50 yards from his bed, the wall faded into shadow, and the outline of an archway could be guessed there. He lay on a wide metal bed. The surface was hard and covered with a thin layer of antibacterial material. There were no blankets or pillows. He braced his hands against the edges. His fingers squeezed the cold metal. He gave a push. His spine cracked, but his body rose. He caught his breath. His heart began to beat faster, but it didn't race in a frantic rhythm like before. He had shortness of breath, but it didn't feel as if he had run a marathon. He lowered his legs to the floor. The cold, smooth material burned the soles of his feet. He looked down. He saw wide hospital pants with an elastic waistband. And that was all. He was barefoot. There were no shoes. He had taken off his sneakers back at his apartment, or in that empty white room where they had put him to sleep. His socks had disappeared, along with the rest of his civilian clothes. Now he was dressed in a sterile, government-issue uniform for test subjects. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily, and looked around. The hall was absolutely empty. There was no medical equipment, no IV drips, and no staff. There were no soundproofing screens or neighboring beds. There was only total clinical sterility. "Is anyone there?" he asked, and his voice sounded like a crow's caw. It was hoarse and strangled. There was only silence. He heard only the hum of the ventilation system. He tried to stand on his feet. He leaned against the edge of the bed. He tensed his thighs. His joints creaked and his knees shook, but he straightened up. A strange metal frame stood next to the bed. It was a walker. It was an improved, massive version of those tubular structures that old people walk with after breaking a hip. This one was made of thick aluminum, featuring wide, rubberized armrests and heavy-duty wheels. The structure was designed to support an enormous weight. He gripped the handles. The metal chilled his palms. The walker added stability. The world stopped swaying. He took his first step. The small wheels rolled silently across the plastic floor. He took a second step. It was difficult. His 3 chins jiggled and sweat broke out on his forehead. But he was walking. Far ahead, near the archway, he noticed a gleam. It was a small metal pedestal at waist height, and on it sat a red button. It was the only spot of color in this sterile, white madness. His logic, unclouded by drugs, worked clearly. It was a call button. It meant staff. It meant answers to his questions. And perhaps it meant water. He wanted to drink unbearably. He moved forward. It was the longest journey of his life. It was 50 yards. He used to walk 10 steps to the bathroom and feel like he had unloaded a boxcar of coal. Now, he had walked 10 yards. He stopped. He hung his head, leaning heavily on the armrests of the walker. He drew in air hoarsely. 20 yards. His heart pounded in his throat. His back ached. His thigh muscles, unaccustomed to work, burned with a dull pain. 30 yards. He stopped for a longer time. He closed his eyes. The thought of lying down right there on the cold floor crept into his head. He wanted to curl up in a ball and wait. They would come, wouldn't they? It was a clinic. The last chance. They were supposed to heal him, monitor him, and set up IV drips. But no one came. The hum of the ventilation system remained monotonous and indifferent. He gritted his teeth. He squeezed the handle so hard that his knuckles turned white within the folds of fat. He took a step, then another step. 40 yards. His bare feet shuffled across the floor, leaving damp trails of sweat. The skin on his heels began to itch from friction against the perfectly smooth plastic. 45 yards. He reached the pedestal. He leaned against it with all his weight, miraculously avoiding breaking the structure. Breathing heavily, he stared at the red button. It was a plastic part recessed into a metal panel. There were no labels. There were no microphones for communication. It was just a button. He raised a trembling hand. His fingers slipped on the sweaty skin of his palm. He pushed down. Click. It was a sharp, mechanical sound, and immediately, from a hidden niche right below the button, a panel silently slid out. A metal tray appeared. On the tray stood a large plastic cup of clear water, and right next to it, on a small white cardboard plate, lay his prize. It was a hamburger. It was a large, classic one. It featured a sesame seed bun, melted yellow cheese, a toasted patty, peeking lettuce leaves, and drops of ketchup. The smell hit his nostrils more powerfully than any smelling salts. It was the smell of fried meat, spices, and sweetness. His stomach twisted in a spasm. Saliva instantly filled his mouth. He forgot about the pain in his spine. He forgot about his thirst. He grabbed the hamburger with both hands. The bread crumpled under the pressure of his thick fingers. He sank his teeth into it. The taste of meat, juice, salt. He chewed almost without thinking, swallowing huge chunks. He washed it down with icy water from the cup. He took another bite. Half of the hamburger disappeared in 3 motions. It was gone. He licked the ketchup off his fingers. He looked at the empty piece of cardboard. Somewhere above, a voice rang out. It came from above. It originated from the same invisible speakers as on the first day of initiation. It was synthesized and steady. Day 1. Task completed. He froze, leaning heavily against the pedestal. Every breath came with a wheeze. His pulse frantically beat a rhythm in his temples. It was a large hamburger. It contained a lot of calories for a normal person. It was 300 or 400 calories. But for him, who was accustomed to consuming thousands of calories in one sitting, it was nothing. It was merely a warm-up for his stretched stomach. His stomach had just woken up. It demanded more. It demanded 3 times as much, his usual quota. He began to slap his palm against the red button. He hit it once, twice, a third time. There was no effect. The tray retracted back into the panel against the dull resistance of servo motors. The metal clanked, cutting off his hope. "Hey!" he wheezed, throwing his head back toward the ceiling. "Is that all? Hey!" Silence was his answer. There was only the measured, indifferent rustle of the ventilation. No one was watching him. Or rather, they were watching, but they had no intention of interfering. "I want to eat!" He slammed his fist against the smooth, white plastic. Pain echoed in his wrist and shot up to his elbow. He didn't leave a dent. The material was stronger than stone. Silence fell again. He stood there, leaning on his walker, and looked at the archway receding into the depths. Behind it, a similarly endless hallway could be seen, flooded with deathly white light. The meaning of what was happening began to dawn on him. It was the cruel, naked truth of the contract's terms. There were no doctors with dietary charts here. There were no smiling nurses. There were no psychologists ready to listen about his difficult childhood and stress eating. There were no soothing IV drips with vitamins. There was a huge hall. There was a walker. And there was a button that he had to crawl to in order to get just enough food so he wouldn't die of starvation right there. He received just enough to jumpstart the engine of an organism accustomed to a surplus of fuel. They gave him fast food not out of mercy. The fast food was a concentrate. It was dirty carbohydrate energy that would burn out in hours, leaving behind an even sharper, more agonizing emptiness. This was torture. It was a hunt. It was controlled starvation. He looked back at the bed, which looked orphaned 50 yards behind him. The journey back now seemed twice as long. A vector moved up, and a vector moved down. "Bastards," he whispered with his dry lips. The sound drowned in the massive room. His legs trembled. He had to go back. Lying by the button made no sense. The system had made it perfectly clear that there would be no second chance that day. The dispensing window was closed. He transferred his weight onto the aluminum handles. The walker groaned pitifully but firmly supported his mass. He turned around. He took his first step. Then he took a second. The pain in his thighs, which were unaccustomed to carrying such a load over such a distance twice a day, intensified. His calf muscles cramped. His heels rubbed against the plastic. But now this physical pain mixed with something else. a primal, sucking emptiness in his stomach. His stomach digested the burger in record time and began to digest itself. It secreted gastric acid, burning and caustic, triggering bouts of heartburn. He trudged toward the bed. It was 30 yards. What would happen tomorrow? Tomorrow would bring exactly the same thing. It was 20 yards. The light remained steady. There was no day and no night. There was only an illusion of time, measured by the voice from the speaker announcing, "Day 1." It was 10 yards. He didn't want to go on. He wanted to drop the walker, collapse onto the floor, and howl. But the floor was cold, and there was no one to howl to. There were no spectators. There were only the lenses of hidden cameras recording his every breath. He reached the metal bed. He tumbled onto it, panting heavily. His muscles cramped, but he couldn't move to stretch them out. The metal of the examination table drew the heat away from his sweaty back. His gaze fixed on the shadowless ceiling. The panels glowed white. They were not treating him. They were training him. He was like a laboratory rat conditioned to a reflex. If he reached the button, he got a reward. The reward was a hamburger. It was a mockery. He closed his eyes. He needed to conserve his energy. If he had to walk to that damn button again tomorrow, he would need hidden reserves. And his organism would start looking for them. It would start melting down those exact 800 pounds that he had come here to destroy. The method was monstrous in its simplicity and cruelty. It was the deprivation of choice. You either walked and ate, or you lay there and died agonizingly in the sterile silence. For the first time in 10 years, he fell asleep with an icy, penetrating sense of genuine, non-psychological hunger. His breathing gradually leveled out. The hum of the ventilation lulled him, pretending to be silence. Sleep came quickly, dragging him into a blackness where there was neither pain nor hamburgers. There was only an endless white hall and a red button acting as a beacon on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the hall, the system switched its algorithm to standby mode. Day 1 was over. Day 2 was already waiting in the wings. And the schedule was rigid. The cameras continued to record the infrared radiation of the massive body on the bed. The sensors took readings of his heartbeat. Everything was going according to plan. It always went according to plan. The weak were weeded out, and the strong moved on to the next level. He didn't know the rules yet, but his body had already begun the game. Awakening on the second day differed little from the first. There was the same white clinical sterility and the same shadowless light from the plastic ceiling panels. And there was the same monotonous, maddening hum of the ventilation. He lay on the rigid metal examination table and listened to his body. The metallic taste in his mouth had grown sharper. His stomach spasmed with such force that it felt like his insides were being twisted into a tight sailor's knot. Hunger hadn't just woken up with him. It had been on duty all night, waiting for his consciousness to return to its post so it could unleash a wave of agonizing emptiness upon him. 800 pounds of living mass demanded energy. His massive heart, locked inside a cage of fat, stubbornly pumped blood, expending precious calories even at rest. With great effort, he turned his head toward the invisible archway. It was 50 yards away. Yesterday, that distance had seemed like a marathon. Today, it presented itself as an impassable abyss. His thigh muscles, having endured an unprecedented load the day before, burned with a dull, white-hot fire. His calves had turned to wood. His soles, rubbed raw against the smooth plastic, itched fiercely. But there was no choice. Or rather, the choice was articulated by the system's silence. Lie there and die, or get up and go get your hand out. He clenched his teeth so hard that his enamel creaked. He rolled onto his side. He swung his swollen legs off the edge of the examination table. Pain hit his nerve endings like an electric shock. His knees buckled, but he managed to grab the rubberized armrests of the massive aluminum walker in time. His breathing broke into a wheeze. Sweat instantly broke out on his forehead, flooding his eyes with caustic salt. He took his first step. The walker's small wheels let out a quiet squeak. Every yard he covered sucked away his strength. The pain in his chafed heels became sharp and pulsating. He walked barefoot across the perfectly flat floor, leaving an invisible trail of torment behind him. His 3 chins jiggled in time with every heavy step. The thick skin of his stomach, covered in diaper rash, rubbed against the edge of his hospital pants. It was 20 yards. He stopped, leaning all his weight on the saving frame. His vision went dark. Air whistled into his lungs, but there was a catastrophic lack of oxygen. "Bastards," he wheezed into the emptiness. The answer was a quiet hum. The system didn't react to insults. The system needed actions. It was 40 yards. His fingers dug into the handles with a death grip. He was no longer walking. He was dragging his legs, using the walker like crutches. A metal pedestal with a solitary red button loomed before his eyes. That piece of plastic had become the center of his universe, his reason for existence, and his sole deity in this white hell. It was 50. He collapsed chest first onto the pedestal, miraculously not tearing it off its mounts. A trembling hand, wet with sweat, reached for the button. Click. He heard the hiss of pneumatics. A metal tray obediently slid out from a hidden niche. There was a plastic cup of clear water, and there was a piece of cardboard. He stared intently at the food. Yesterday, it had been a large classic burger. That was 1,200 calories. Today, a standard cheeseburger lay on the cardboard. It consisted of a small, dried-out bun, a flattened shoe sole of a meat patty, a solitary slice of cheese, and a drop of mustard. He froze. His hand hovered over the tray. "Are you kidding me?" His voice broke, turning into a pitiful bleat. This wasn't 1,200 calories, this was barely 400. It was 400 calories for an organism that burned 5,000 a day just to breathe and drag mountains of fat around. Thirst and instinct overpowered his anger. He grabbed the cheeseburger. He shoved it into his mouth whole without even biting it. He made 2 frantic chewing motions, and it was swallowed. He dumped the water into his mouth, gulping so greedily that some of it spilled onto his hospital gown. The tray immediately disappeared into the depths of the wall with a mechanical clack. It sounded like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. From above came a steady, emotionless, synthesized voice. Day 2, task completed. Caloric intake, 400 kilocalories. He slammed his fist against the wall above the button. A dull sound echoed from the impact against the ultra-durable plastic. "I'll starve to death in here! Do you hear me?" The cameras, hidden behind the matte panels, dispassionately recorded his hysteria. No one answered. The hunger, which had retreated for a moment thanks to the tiny portion of food, returned with double the force, multiplied by disappointment and adrenaline. Gastric juice burned his insides. He slowly turned around. It was 50 yards back. The vector moved down. This journey was more terrifying. There was no longer any hope of food at the end of it. There was only the bare, hard metal bed where he would be left to go crazy from hunger for the next 24 hours. The third day blurred the lines of reality. When he reached the button, overcoming the unbearable pain in his bleeding soles and burning muscles, he received 2 apples and a glass of water. The fourth day brought a portion of a protein shake, 300 milliliters of thick, tasteless sludge that didn't even cover the bottom of his stretched stomach. On the fifth day, he cried. He cried from powerlessness, anger, and animal hunger, smearing tears mixed with cold sweat across his puffy face. The tray gave him a handful of unsalted peanuts. They were breaking him. They did it systematically, with mathematically calculated steps. The system left him no right to break down. It was impossible to open a refrigerator at night. It was impossible to call for delivery. There was only a white hall. There was a walker, and there was a red button. He began to notice changes on the 7th day. In the morning, as he peeled his body off the examination table, he realized that the pain in his joints had changed. It hadn't gone away, but the dull sense of heaviness tearing his back had dulled slightly. His lower back still ached, but when he lowered his legs to the floor, he didn't stagger as badly as he had on the first day. He gripped the walker. He took a step. His wide, elastic-waisted pants, which used to tightly hug his hips, now slipped off slightly, gathering in absurd folds at his waist. He instinctively hitched them up. His organism, deprived of an external influx of dirty energy, had shifted into survival mode. Internal cannibalism kicked in. His body began to devour itself, melting down decades-old fat reserves in the giant furnace of its metabolism. That equaled 30 to 40,000 calories of deficit per week. It was an extreme weight loss that would have led to kidney failure or cardiac arrest in any normal clinic. But here, his parameters were being monitored by invisible automatics. He was sure of it. The voice announced the start of the day only when his blood markers, read by hidden sensors, fell within an acceptable range. They brought him to the very edge, holding him over the abyss of starvation, but they didn't let him fall. The walk to the button took less time. He made it in one go, without stopping for breathers in the middle. His calves still burned, and his chafed heels ached, although the skin had strangely managed to toughen up a bit over the night. But his breathing recovered faster. He slammed the button. The tray obediently slid out. There was a container with unsalted boiled chicken breast, a portion of brown rice, and a glass of water. There was no fast food. It was basic fuel. They were building materials. He ate it all, thoroughly chewing the meat fibers. In the past, he would have called it tasteless cardboard. Now, it seemed like the food of the gods. The tray slid back in. He braced himself to hear the usual, "Day 7, task completed." He prepared to turn around and trudge back to his bed. But the usual didn't happen. The voice from the invisible speakers sounded different. It was not a statement of fact, but an order. Stage 1 is completed. Adaptation is passed. Patient weight, 750 pounds. A weight loss of 42 pounds has been recorded. He froze, listening heavily to those numbers. 42 pounds in a week. It was madness. But the pants flapping at his waist confirmed the facts. The voice didn't stop. Attention. Transition to Stage 2 is approved. Perimeter expansion. A dull, guttural sound echoed from somewhere deep in the hall. The wall hiding the console with the button trembled. The smooth white panels, which had seemed monolithic, slowly slid apart. He took a step back, instinctively shifting his weight onto the armrests of the walker. A new space opened up behind the parted wall. It was another span. It was an exactly similar white, sterile hallway, but it was much longer. In the distance, at the very edge of visibility, a new metal pedestal gleamed. It had a new red button. The distance to the old console had been 50 yards. His eye for distance, sharpened by a week of survival, supplied a grim answer. The new button was located 100 yards from his bed. It was 100 yards there. It was 100 yards back. The dispensing of the daily ration has been transferred to terminal number 2, the synthesized voice announced ruthlessly. The regulations remain the same. The wall behind him, where just a minute ago there had been the saving button that gave him rice and chicken, closed up, leaving no seam. The rules of the game had changed. He was 42 pounds lighter. It was a little easier for him to breathe. In return, the system had doubled the distance. He stood on the border of the old and new sectors. Covering 200 yards a day for a man weighing 750 pounds was a death sentence. But a familiar, sucking emptiness was already germinating in his stomach, reminding him of the portion that now waited for him somewhere out there, beyond the horizon of the new white tunnel. He sighed, gripped the handles of the walker tighter with his damp palms, and took his first step into stage number 2. Time in the clinic didn't flow, it dripped. It dripped monotonously and hollowly, measuring every step with a portion of burning pain and an animalistic, maddening hunger. Rudin stopped counting the days. The system called out numbers. Day 20, day 43, but they had lost their meaning for him. Only the distance mattered. It was 200 yards, then 300, then 400. The white, perfectly smooth walls of the hallways folded into an endless surgical labyrinth. The shadowless light burned away his colorful dreams, leaving only the gray, sticky reality of his awakenings. His diet shrank along a logarithmic spiral. He received a piece of fish without salt. He received half a grapefruit. He received 3 ounces of bland buckwheat. Every new stage opened with a mockingly silent sliding of the walls, and every time, the red button turned out to be further away. He had changed. This didn't happen with the snap of a finger, but through agonizing, second-by-second reforging. The enormous biomass that he once called his body was melting in the furnace of a brutal caloric deficit. The wide hospital pants that used to cut into his stomach now hung on him like a sack on a scarecrow. He constantly had to hitch them up. His knees, which had absorbed bone-breaking loads, stopped creaking with every movement, although a dull, nagging note remained in them forever. The skin on his heels, chafed against the plastic floor, grew calloused, turning into a yellowish, hard armor. He was no longer a helpless slab of meat. He had become a machine for extracting food. He had to reach the button. He had to get his ration. He had to survive. But today, everything went wrong. He woke up to the fact that the hum of the ventilation seemed lower. His body, tuned to a mocking but stable schedule, signaled its readiness for a forced march of 500 yards. That was the current distance of stage 4. Rudin swung his legs off the examination table. He habitually grabbed the worn rubber handles of the walker. His fingers closed around the aluminum like steel vices. Far ahead, veiled in the grayish haze of perspective, his goal loomed. He started walking. He took a step, then another step. His breathing no longer faltered after 10 yards. It was steady and deep. His calves worked, pumping blood, and his abdominal muscles, hidden beneath folds of excess skin that sagged like an empty backpack, tensed. 300 yards later, he saw it. Right in the middle of the hallway, blocking the path to the coveted pedestal, a wide metal platform was embedded in the floor. It was a square, about 3 feet by 3 feet. He couldn't go around it, and he couldn't jump over it. He stopped, swallowing his viscous saliva heavily. The walker stopped an inch from the edge of the metal. The system had never put up obstacles before. It had only imposed distance. "What is this?" His voice, hoarse and cracked from long silence, echoed down the white tunnel. Silence was the answer. His stomach twisted in a spasm, reminding him that not a single crumb had entered it since the previous evening. The food lay out there. It was beyond that platform. Rudin took a step forward. His bare, calloused foot stepped onto the icy metal. Then he moved his second foot. He pulled the walker in after him, transferring some of his weight onto it. Click. It was a mechanical, dry sound from beneath the floor. The platform under his feet sank barely noticeably. From above, a voice rang out from the hidden speakers. It was the same synthesized voice, but now its electronic overtones seemed to carry an icy statement of the inevitable. Control weigh-in completed. Current body mass 570 pounds. Recording the metric. The required deficit to transition to the next stage has not been achieved. 220 pounds. He stood on the scale and stared into the void. He had lost 220 pounds of living mass. It was 220 pounds of fat, water, and torment. Any normal person would have celebrated this as a rebirth. But there were no normal people here, and there were no celebrations. "What do you mean, not achieved?" he wheezed, throwing his head back. 220 pounds! You burned 220 pounds off me. What else do you need? Initiating emergency stimulation protocol, the system responded dispassionately. A click sounded in the distance. Rudin sharply turned his head. The pedestal with the button, which was no more than 200 yards away, slowly began to sink into the floor. "No! Stop!" He lunged forward, forgetting about the walker. His legs buckled and he stumbled, falling heavily onto the smooth plastic. His knee burned with dull pain from the impact. He crawled, gripping with his fingers like a death vise, tearing his nails. "Stop, you bitch!" he screamed, tearing his voice. The wall closed over the sunken pedestal. It formed a smooth, even seam. At that same second, from the panel closest to him, a small tray slid out with a quiet hiss. It held only a glass of distilled water. There was no food. He crawled to the tray. He grabbed the glass with trembling hands. He tried to find at least something behind the plastic panel, a crumb, a forgotten wrapper, a crack. There was nothing. He found only metal and plastic. He drank the water. It dropped into his empty stomach like an icy stone, causing an agonizing cramp. The tray retracted. The day was over. Rudin remained sitting on the floor. His eyes darted wildly across the smooth walls. They took the food away. Completely. It was a complete breakdown of the paradigm. Previously, the system had been cruel but fair. You walked through hell and you got a reward. The reward might have been pathetic and meager, but it gave a chance to live until tomorrow. Now the rules had disappeared. He leaned his back against the cool wall. He pulled his knees toward him, wrapping his arms around them. The pain began at night. His stomach, which had previously received at least microscopic doses of protein and fiber, was now idling. The gastric juice ate away at his mucous membrane. Heartburn rose up his esophagus like a burning flame that made him want to scream. But that was only the physics. The other reality was more terrifying. Fear arrived. It was a warm, sticky fear of death. On the second day without food, he stopped getting up from the floor. The walker lay nearby like the skeleton of a dead aluminum beast. Rudin lay on his side, curled into a fetal position. He remembered Mark. He saw the face of his brother standing in the hallway of his stinking apartment. He remembered the neat suit and the contemptuous, pitying look. Did Mark know? Did he know what torments he was sending him to? Or was that contact number simply a way to cleanly erase him from his perfect life? On the third day, the breaking point arrived. It was an absolute realization of the meaninglessness of his existence, one that burned him to the ground. The illusion that he was fighting for his life collapsed. He had been fighting for a hamburger. He fought for rice. He fought for a ration. And now, when the system disconnected him from that basic human need, he became a zero. A wave of desperate, burning self-pity suddenly overwhelmed him. It wasn't pity for that biomass with shortness of breath, but for the man who had once wanted to be happy. He remembered being a healthy engineer. He recalled his dreams of a family. He thought of his once beloved wife, who had left, unable to bear his progressing depression and the growing numbers on the scale. He remembered sitting in an empty apartment day after day, washing down his grief with sweet soda, plugging the void with dough and meat, and building those folds of fat like a fortress wall against a hostile world. It was a life draining into nowhere. "What for?" he wheezed, burying his face in the crook of his elbow. The acoustics of the empty white hallway turned his whisper into a snake's hiss. Tears suddenly poured from his eyes. They were sharp, hot, and salty. They flowed down cheeks that had long forgotten a razor, got stuck in his thick stubble, and dripped onto the white plastic floor, leaving dark spots. He sobbed. He sobbed loudly, terribly, at the top of his voice. This wasn't the crying of an offended child. It was the howl of an animal caught in a trap, gnawing off its own paw and realizing that the hunter was still close. Terror, loneliness, and pain concentrated into one unceasing, chest-crushing sound. He beat his fists against the flawless white floor. He knocked his knuckles until they bled. His skin burst open, leaving red smears on the plastic. "Open up!" he yelled at the shadowless ceiling, choking on his tears. "I'll die! I give up! Stop this!" No one answered him. Even the hum of the ventilation remained unchanged, indifferent to his agony. He cried for an hour or two until the tears ran dry. It was dehydration, exacerbated by a lack of food. There wasn't even fluid left inside him to cry. On the fourth day, he was delirious. He hallucinated smells. He smelled garlic sauce for pizza. He smelled fried bacon. He smelled cinnamon from freshly baked rolls. He opened his eyes and grabbed the air with lips parched and cracked into deep fissures. The air remained sterile. His organism had switched into a mode of fatal energy conservation. His heart beat infrequently, skipping beats. A continuous ringing stood in his ears. 220 pounds less. The same endless thought beat in his fading brain. Not achieved. On the fifth day, a sound shattered the silence. It was not the voice of the system. It was the heavy, metallic scrape of stone against concrete. Rudin pried open his eyelids, which were glued together with purulent discharge. The wall in front of him, where the food dispensing button had once disappeared, was no longer a white panel. It had risen, exposing the bowels of this damned complex. What drifted from there wasn't the smell of sterility and climate control. A damp, heavy chill struck him. It brought the smell of damp earth, mold, and stagnant water. It was the smell of a crypt. With great effort, he rolled onto his stomach. His muscles disobeyed, and his body trembled in constant chills of exhaustion. He pulled the walker toward himself. He grabbed the metal, which now seemed icy compared to the temperature of his feverish body. He got to his knees. Then he pushed himself onto his disobedient legs. His head spun so violently that he had to squeeze his eyes shut, waiting until the black circles swimming before his eyes stopped pulsating in time with his weak heartbeat. He walked to the edge of the opening. The light was gone. The shadowless panels remained behind. Ahead reigned a twilight illuminated only by dirty yellow dust-covered lamps protected by wire mesh embedded directly into the stone walls. Yes, it was stone. It wasn't plastic or surgical steel. It was rough, hewn basalt from which cold water dripped. It was a corridor carved out of solid rock, and it didn't lead straight. It led upward. Rudin stood at the foot of a giant staircase. The steps were wide and uneven, each about 8 inches high. The width of the flight was nearly 10 feet. He raised his head. The staircase curved and disappeared in the pitch darkness, dissolving somewhere at an unimaginable height. By a rough estimate, it was 500 yards at least, judging by the steepness of the climb. And there were no ramps or elevators. There was no way to roll the walker up these steps. The system finally broke its silence. The synthesized, ruthless voice came not from above, but from an old, dusty speaker on the basalt wall. Stage 5, Overcoming Protocol. The calorie dispensing point is located at the top of the climb. Time limit, none established. The voice fell silent, leaving behind only an echo and the sound of moisture dripping against stone. "You've got to be kidding me," Rudin whispered with parched lips. He had to climb 500 yards up a steep stone staircase. He was a man weighing 570 pounds who hadn't eaten anything in 4 days and suffered from total dehydration. This wasn't a test. This was an execution. It was a sophisticated, slow execution. Rudin looked at his walker. It was useless aluminum meant for flat surfaces. He unclasped his hands. The frame crashed onto the stone floor with a clatter. The ringing bounced off the walls and flew up the shaft. If he didn't go, he would die right there, on the flat floor where the 2 sectors met. He would die of hunger or thirst. If he went, he would most likely die of a heart attack somewhere around the 20th step. There was no choice. It was the same as always in this place. He lowered himself heavily, applying all his weight onto the first damp basalt step. He got on all fours. There was no other way to drag such a mass upward without a cane or a handrail. He made a jerk. Then he tackled the second step. The stone tore the skin on his knees to bloody shreds before the 10th flight. His pants grew soaked from the dampness and the water dripping from the ceiling. He crawled like a wounded mammal, clinging with a death grip of exhausted fingers to the unevenness of the masonry. Every breath came with a wheeze. His heart beat against his ribs like a sledgehammer, demanding oxygen and energy that he simply didn't have. 20 steps. 30. He stopped at every fifth step, pressing his sweaty, dirty cheek against the icy stone, closed his eyes, and prayed for his heart to simply stop. He prayed for this torture to end. 50 steps. The muscles of his arms filled with lead. One knee throbbed with sharp pain at every movement. Most likely, a ligament was torn, or his meniscus was damaged. 60. He crawled onto a small intermediate landing. It was a completely flat recess, about 5 feet wide before the staircase went further upward. A dim yellow lamp, hidden behind a grate, snatched a gray corner out of the twilight. Rudin stopped, panting heavily. He slowly raised his head. In the corner, leaning its back against the cold basalt, someone was sitting. Rudin blinked, deciding that this was another hallucination caused by extreme exhaustion. His brain was playing tricks on him. But the vision didn't disappear. He crawled closer. The smell of death, stale dust, and dried skin hit his nostrils clearer than any illusion. It was a corpse. It was a person, or rather, what was left of one. It was a dried mummy covered in blackened skin. Bones protruded distinctly through tightly stretched flaps of flesh. Sunken eye sockets loomed black in the skull, staring into the void straight ahead. The jaw hung open in an eternal, mute scream of pain. But the most terrifying thing was something else. The mummy wore wide, gray, government-issue hospital pants. They were exactly the same as the ones currently hanging like a sack on Rudin. A dirty, decayed patient's gown dangled around the neck. And this person had been large. Even now, shriveled to the state of parchment, the skeleton betrayed an original, enormous size. The person suffered from extreme obesity, possessing wide femurs and a massive rib cage. He was exactly like Rudin, and he hadn't made it. He broke down on the 60th step of the 500-yard climb. Or he died of exhaustion, or his heart stopped. The fact remained a fact. He stayed lying there in that deathly yellow light, forever becoming a warning to anyone who followed into Stage 5. Rudin, not tearing his gaze away from the empty eye sockets of the dead man, slowly lowered himself onto the landing with his back against the wall. He folded his legs and wrapped his arms around them. The cold of the stone penetrated his bones, just as it had once penetrated the bones of his neighbor. There was no longer any fear. His consciousness, scorched by 4 days of absolute starvation and psychosis, perceived the dead man not as a horror, but as an inevitability. "Hello," Rudin whispered with parched, bloody lips. The dead man remained silent, answering only with silence and the smell of dust. Rudin leaned his head against the stone, right next to his predecessor's mummified shoulder. He wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't go any more today. Perhaps he would never go again. He stayed on the landing for the night, sharing the icy stone with the one who had shown him the true price of this last chance. The night passed in a state of semi-oblivion. Rudin lay on the cold basalt landing, his back pressed against the rough wall, and listened to the silence. To his right, barely visible in the yellowish light of the dusty lamp, the dried mummy of the previous prisoner remained frozen. There was no longer any fear. 4 days of absolute, exhausting starvation had burned away all his emotions, leaving only an animalistic emptiness. The dead man didn't frighten him. He had become a silent witness. He was the one who had proved that the system wasn't bluffing. You could really die here, if you gave up, or if you ran out of strength. Somewhere far below, beyond 1,500 feet of sheer stairs and hundreds of yards of level corridors, his comfort zone remained. There was a level white surface where his walker used to roll. There was shadowless light. There was an illusion of safety. Here, on the stone staircase, it smelled of dampness and a crypt. Rudin opened his eyes. His brain, which had switched into total energy-saving mode, worked slowly. His thoughts turned like millstones. 570 pounds. He had lost 220 pounds. He was lighter, but that weight still remained a monstrous shackle pinning him to the floor. He turned his head toward the mummy. "Why did you give up?" Rudin wheezed. His voice sounded like the rustle of dry leaves. His lips were so badly cracked that bloody fluid oozed from them. "Were you in pain too?" The dead man bore his dried teeth and kept his secret. Rudin looked at his hands. His fingers had grown calloused and his nails were broken. He slowly pulled his legs beneath him. His knee, which he had injured the day before, exploded with a sharp, pulsating pain. A meniscus or a ligament. It didn't matter now. There was no doctor here. He leaned his bloody hands against the icy basalt and tried to stand up. His body groaned with 1,000 voices. His calves cramped. He couldn't stand straight. Without his walker, his center of gravity shifted and his back couldn't bear the load. He collapsed back onto all fours. He looked up the stairs. Yellow, dusty lanterns snatched steep steps out of the gloom. How many more were there? 100? 200? If he stayed here, he would join the company of the Silent Witness. He would become the second skeleton in government-issue pants. His stomach, which had long ceased demanding food and had switched to digesting the organism's internal resources, suddenly cramped with a sharp, agonizing spasm. It wasn't ordinary hunger. It was the cry of his dying flesh demanding at least a gram of glucose to support his fading brain. The instinct for self-preservation, which had slept beneath layers of despair, suddenly woke up. It struck his blood with a massive release of adrenaline, making him forget about the pain in his knee and his bloody hands. Rudin began to crawl. He clung to the protruding edges of the basalt steps. He transferred his weight onto his healthy leg, dragging the injured one behind him. Every movement was accompanied by a dull growl escaping through his clenched teeth. It was the 65th step, then the 70th. Sweat flooded his eyes, washing the purulent film from them. His pants restricted his movements, hanging like a sack on his thinned thighs. He pulled them higher and tied a knot in the elastic waistband so he wouldn't get tangled in his own clothes. He crawled for an hour, or maybe 2. Time lost its meaning on that damned staircase. He reached the 40th landing. It was another recess in the rock. He tumbled onto the flat stone and rolled onto his back, drawing in the damp air heavily with a whistle. His heart beat somewhere in his throat, ready to tear his ribcage apart. After resting for a few minutes, he raised his head again. The staircase didn't end. It went higher and higher, piercing straight through the rock. But something had changed. It was the air. It no longer smelled of stagnant water and damp stone. A barely perceptible freshness appeared in it. It was the smell of salt. It was the smell of the wind. Rudin froze. Salt? Where would wind come from underground? That thought gave him strength that seemed to no longer exist. He rolled back onto all fours and continued to crawl. It was the 80th step, then the 100th. The stone grew drier. The yellow lamps disappeared, replaced by a strange gray glow falling from somewhere above. It was the 120th step. Rudin raised his head. The staircase was ending. Directly above him gaped a hole through which dim daylight poured. He made one last lunge. His fingers, stripped of flesh, dug into the smooth metal edge of the hatch. He pulled himself up, ignoring the crack of tearing muscles, and tumbled over the edge. He hit his shoulder against something hard and remained lying on his stomach with his eyes closed. The wind blew in his face. It was a real, cold, piercing wind. He slowly opened his eyes. A new white ward didn't stretch out before him, and it wasn't a basalt crypt. Before him was the sky. It was heavy, leaden, and hung low over churning gray water. Rudin propped himself up on his elbows. He was on the top of a cliff. Below him, about 1,000 feet down, the ocean roared, raging and smashing enormous foamy waves against the black rocks of the coast. Gusts of wind knocked him off balance, making him shiver in his thin hospital gown. He turned around. Behind him rose a solid wall of gray concrete. It contained the hatch he had just climbed out of. And there was nothing else. There were no clinic buildings, fences, or roads. There was only a sheer cliff dropping into the raging sea. This was the edge of the world. It was the end of geography. His eyes, accustomed to the twilight, stung from the sparse daylight. And then he saw it. 10 yards from the hatch, standing right in the wind, was a metal pedestal. It was an exact replica of the one in the White Hall, and on it sat a bright yellow spot. Bananas. It was a regular bunch of yellow, ripe bananas. There were 4 of them. His stomach, which had slept for the last 2 days, woke up with such force that it bent Rudin in half. The pain was deafening. It wasn't just hunger. It was the hysteria of an organism that had laid eyes on salvation. He tried to stand on his feet, but a piercing pain in his knee threw him back onto the rocks. He crawled, leaving a bloody trail on the gray basalt slabs and tearing his pants at the knees. He crawled to the pedestal, the way a wounded soldier crawls to cover. He moved toward the icy wind coming from the ocean. 10 yards seemed to him like the distance from the earth to the moon. He made it. He grabbed the metal stand with bloody fingers and pulled himself up, leaning heavily on his healthy leg. The bunch of bananas lay on the tray. There was no water or plates nearby. There was only fruit. He grabbed one. His fingers disobeyed him as he peeled back the thick yellow skin. He bit off half of it without even letting it fully ripen in his hands. The taste hit his receptors like an explosion. It brought sweetness and viscous pulp. The sugar instantly absorbed into his blood. It tasted better than any steak or any pizza he had ever eaten in his past fat life. He swallowed the first banana in 3 seconds. He immediately grabbed a second. Then he stopped. His hand containing the half-peeled second banana hovered in the air. He looked around. He saw the gray sky. He saw the sheer cliff. He saw the raging ocean. And he saw the concrete wall behind him. There was no way out. He stood on a narrow patch of basalt in the middle of nowhere. There was nowhere to run from here. If he took a step to the left or right, he would fall down and smash against the rocks. Behind him lay 1,500 feet of sheer stairs descending into darkness, leading back to the silent witness. The clinic wasn't a building on the outskirts of the city. The clinic was a massive underground bunker gnawing into a rock on an unknown island or wild cape. It was a bunker from which there was no exit to freedom. "There's no way out," he whispered. The banana fell from his weakened fingers onto the gray stone. The system had no intention of letting him go. It had simply expanded the enclosure. He heard a voice. The familiar, synthesized voice rang out from a hidden speaker, drowning out the noise of the waves. Stage 5 completed. Target distance, 1 mile. Route completion time, 60 minutes. The countdown has begun. Rudin threw his head up. 1 mile. To the left of the pedestal, along the edge of the cliff, a narrow, barely visible path had been carved into the rock. It was about 3 feet wide. On one side stood the sheer wall. On the other side lay the abyss and the ocean. It was 1 mile along that path. He had to do it in an hour. It was for a man weighing 570 pounds, possessing a torn meniscus and no shoes. He looked at the remaining 2 bananas. There was no food. This was just fuel for one short dash. A miscalculation meant death by starvation on this narrow path, or it meant a fall into the ocean. His food instinct, warmed by the sweet pulp, came into conflict with an icy terror. If he didn't make it in an hour, the portion would burn up. The system strictly regulated the timing. In the White Hall, he could have crawled all day. Here, a stopwatch had started. He clenched his jaws. For the first time during his entire stay in the clinic, cold, strategic calculation woke up in his consciousness instead of despair. The biomass had died on the stone staircase next to the skeleton. Now, a man backed into a corner stood on the top of the cliff. "You want me to die?" Rudin wheezed, staring into the gray, indifferent lenses of the hidden cameras. "Screw you." He didn't finish the second banana. He picked it up from the ground and brushed off the dust. He carefully wrapped the remainder in its peel and shoved it into the deep pocket of his hospital pants, along with the remaining 2. It was a reserve. It was an emergency supply. It was glucose that would save his brain from shutting down if he fell halfway down the path. He inspected his feet, which were chafed to the bone and bleeding. Stepping barefoot on the sharp stones of the path was impossible. The pain would drive him crazy before he walked even 100 yards. He needed a solution, and he needed it fast. The timer was ticking. He surveyed himself. He wore government-issue pants hanging like a sack. He wore a thin gown. He had to act. Rudin tore the collar of his gown. The thin fabric cracked and gave way. He tore off 2 long strips from the bottom. He squatted on his healthy leg, grimacing from the piercing pain in his knee. Quickly, ignoring the blood staining the fabric, he wrapped the strips around his feet, creating primitive foot wraps. He tied tight knots at his ankles. This wouldn't replace sneakers. The sharp stones would still cut his flesh. But it would provide at least a minimal layer of protection. It would give him a chance. The weak point of this perfect algorithmic torture machine wasn't the distance. The weak point was that they gave him a reason to fight. They showed him the sky. It might have been gray and stormy, but it was real. He straightened up, resting his hand against the cold metal of the pedestal. It was a painfully familiar, hateful pedestal. The goal was 1 mile. The prize was unknown. The reward was simply staying alive. Rudin took his first step onto the narrow stone path, facing the roaring ocean. The wind tried to push him into the abyss with a sharp gust. He pressed his shoulder against the saving concrete wall, maintaining his balance. He maximized the distance between himself and the edge of the cliff. 570 pounds of human despair, wrapped in shreds of government-issue clothing, began its new countdown. The timer had started. The countdown timer, launched by the system's soulless voice, beat in his temples in sync with his pulse. He had 60 minutes. It was 1 mile along the very edge of the abyss. Rudin trudged along the narrow ledge carved into the rock. The basalt stone beneath his feet was as sharp as broken glass. His homemade foot wraps, hastily wound from the torn hem of his hospital gown, soaked through with blood within the first 200 yards, but they served their purpose. They prevented the stones from slicing his flesh down to the bone. The wind from the ocean lashed out, hurling fine water spray into his face. To his right stood a solid gray wall reaching up into the gloomy sky. To his left lay the abyss, at the bottom of which the waves foamed, smashing against the black reefs. It was 570 pounds of human weight balancing on a 3-foot path. One wrong step, one gust of squall wind, and everything would be over. It would end quickly and forever. But he didn't fall. The fury that had flared up within him back there, by the empty pedestal with the bananas, drove him forward faster than the fear of death. At the 400-yard mark, the pain in his torn knee became unbearable. He leaned his shoulder against the rock, breathing heavily. His emergency supply lay in the deep pocket of his wide pants. He had 2.5 bananas. The heat from his body had already begun to warm them through the fabric. He shoved his hand into his pocket, groping for the soft peel. He just wanted to make sure they were there. He wanted to confirm that he wasn't empty. He had energy. He had time. And then his engineer's brain switched on. It was the brain of a man who was used to assembling complex mechanisms from disparate parts. He looked ahead to where the path wound and disappeared behind a rocky outcropping. It was 1 mile. Why were they driving him along this ledge? Why set a timer for 60 minutes? In the white greenhouse, time hadn't mattered. The dispensing pedestals slid out of the floor automatically upon his approach. It relied on mechanics, sensors, and servo motors. But here there was bare rock and an aggressive environment. Sea salt and constant humidity would destroy any delicate automation in a couple of weeks. No panel would slide out from this uneven, crumbling rock. No mechanism would deliver food to the edge of the cliff automatically. That meant that there, at the end of this mile, the food didn't appear by itself. Someone had to place it there. Someone had to come and leave the ration before the timer expired. Or the timer was there specifically so that this someone would have time to leave safely. A cold sweat broke out on Rudin, despite the icy wind. There was a person out there. There was a living person servicing this sector. It was the maintenance staff of the Last Chance. It was a warden, a feeder. And he would come out to the point exactly at the beginning of the 61st minute to record a failure. Or earlier, if he saw on the cameras that the test subject was crawling close. Rudin looked for cameras. There were none. On a rock as flat as a wall, there was nowhere to hide optics so that they wouldn't be flooded by the rain. It was a blind spot. His heart skipped a beat. If this was a blind spot, then the system wasn't monitoring this mile. It was only waiting for him at the finish line. He peeled himself off the wall. He took a step. Then he took another. He didn't need their food at the finish line. He no longer wanted to play Pavlov's dog, crawling for a portion of rice at the sound of a bell. He wanted to get to the one who pressed that bell. 800 yards. 900. The path made a sharp, almost right-angle turn, skirting a massive rock outcropping. Further ahead, about 20 yards away, the path ended in a dead end and widened slightly, turning into a stone balcony over the sea. The familiar metal pedestal stood on the balcony. It was empty. Next to the pedestal, right in the solid rock, the barely visible outlines of a steel door painted the color of the stone could be seen. It had no handle. It only featured an electronic lock on the side. Rudin stopped behind the turn, pressing himself against the cold stone. He couldn't be seen from the balcony or from behind the door. He estimated the time. Judging by his internal rhythm, about 45 minutes had passed. He had another quarter of an hour before the timer expired. He wouldn't walk up to the pedestal. If he approached, the door wouldn't open. They were watching him from in there. They were waiting for him to cross the invisible finish line, grab the ration, and head back, or go into another sector. He cast his eyes at the ground by his feet. There was basalt crumb and shards. Rudin dropped to his knees in his rock-camouflaged position. He selected one of the stones. It was a heavy, sharp shard of rock, the size of a large apple, that fit perfectly into his wide palm. Its edges bit into his calloused flesh. It was primitive. It was animalistic. But it was the first weapon he had acquired during this entire, endless torture. He sat on the cold stone, stretching out his legs that hummed like cast-iron weights, and froze, turning into a statue. He suppressed his breathing, inhaling through an open mouth so as not to make a sound. Time dragged slowly and thickly, like resin. About 10 minutes, or maybe 15, later, a new sound rang out above the roar of the ocean. It was a quiet, electronic beep. Then came the click of heavy deadbolts. Metal clanked. The steel door on the balcony swung open inward. Rudin braced himself like a huge, heavy predator. His torn knee shot pain all the way to the back of his head, but he didn't even wince. His fingers squeezed the sharp stone until they turned white. A figure stepped out from behind the door onto the stone balcony. It was a man dressed entirely in black. He wore a heavy windbreaker, a hood pulled over his head, and a medical mask on his face, hiding its lower half. In his hands, he held a small plastic tray covered with a clear lid. Beneath it lay a piece of boiled meat and some greens. The man took a step toward the pedestal. He moved heavily, waddling from foot to foot, breathing with a slight shortness of breath. He placed the tray on the metal panel. He turned around and cast a glance down the empty path leading behind the saving rock outcropping. Through the roar of the wind, Rudin heard the mumbling muffled by the mask. He croaked, "The fat ass. Didn't make it." The word fat ass clicked in Rudin's head like a trigger. This wasn't automation. This wasn't some higher purpose of healing. It was the mockery of someone who considered himself superior. It came from someone who was full and healthy. Rudin stepped out from behind the rock. He was a silent, massive avenger weighing 1/4 of a ton, with bloody wrappings on his feet and a crazy, burning gaze. The man in black spun around at the sound of footsteps. His eyes widened in panic above the medical mask. He opened his mouth to either scream or say something, and he instinctively jerked back toward the open door. But Rudin was faster. Adrenaline canceled out gravity and the pain in his joints. He lunged forward with his entire monstrous weight. The sharp stones bit into his soles through the bloody fabric of his gown, but he didn't feel it. The man in black darted toward the door, but stumbled over the threshold. Rudin crashed into him like a derailed locomotive. 570 pounds of mass slammed into the warden, crushing him into the steel doorframe. A crunch sounded. It was either the plastic of the windbreaker or the ribs beneath it. "Arr!" Rudin howled, wildly striking out backhandedly with the hand clutching the stone. The blow landed a glancing hit. The rough basalt tore the hood and medical mask from the victim's face, ripping open his cheek. Blood spurted in a dark arc, staining the gray metal of the door. The warden collapsed to his knees, covering his head with his hands and crawling backward in animalistic terror into the depths of the open tunnel, toward where the warm, yellowish light of incandescent bulbs burned. Rudin took a heavy step after him. The stone was clenched in his raised hand, ready to come down on the skull of the one who had starved him. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to smash his head in and devour the meat that remained lying on the pedestal. "Stop!" the man shrieked hysterically, a voice breaking with pain, pressing his back against the wall behind the door. "Don't kill me!" Rudin froze. His hand with the stone hovered in the air. He stared at the warden's face, illuminated by the light from the tunnel. Blood flowed down a pale, flabby cheek from a shallow cut. But the cut wasn't what stopped Rudin. The face itself stopped him. It was round. It was puffy. 3 chins shook with terror. A massive stomach and immense thighs could be guessed beneath the thick, black windbreaker. The man on the floor, writhing in fear, weighed no less than 400 pounds. The warden wasn't a fit military man or a cold sadist in a white coat. He was the exact same fat, sick person from a past life. Wide gray hospital pants peeked out from under the hiked-up windbreaker. They were exactly the same as Rudin's. They were exactly the same as those on the mummy on the stairs. "You," Rudin wheezed, feeling reality crack. His knees buckled, and he leaned his hand against the wall next to the wounded man. The man shrunk into a ball, smearing blood across his face. I'm just a delivery boy," the fat man sobbed, looking at the bloody stone in Rudin's hand. "I walked this path a year ago. I made it. They said if I wanted to stop, I had to feed the new ones. Please." Rudin lowered his arm. The shadow from his bulky figure fell across the patient, cowering on the floor. Emptiness rang in his head. The prison didn't end with a mile and a staircase. The prison became a job. And he had just spilled first blood. It was his own blood, and the blood of a slave just like himself. Beyond the door, the tunnel went deep into the rock. It was dry there. There was no wind. The system's base was located there, and now that path was open. The heavy metal door remained behind him. Rudin stepped over the warden, cowering on the floor, without even glancing at him a second time. The pity for that puffy slab of flesh who had traded his freedom for the right to carry rations to others evaporated as quickly as it had arisen. In his left hand, Rudin still tightly gripped the bloody shard of basalt. With his right hand, He picked up the tray of boiled meat and greens from the metal pedestal, the very food over which he had almost become a murderer. The tunnel, illuminated by the steady light of yellowish lamps, led deep into the rock massif. The air here was drier, supersaturated with oxygen from a powerful ventilation system. This was the real base. It was the flip side of the last chance. 50 yards later, the corridor widened, transitioning into a spacious hall. Rudin stopped, leaning heavily against the wall. His knee, running on fumes and adrenaline, began to ache again with double force. The foot wraps made from his hospital gown had dried to his chafed soles, turning into a crust of clotted blood and fabric. He inspected the room. It wasn't a server room. It wasn't a guard barracks. It was a giant sports hangar filled with iron. There were dozens of treadmills, ellipticals, power racks, and dumbbell racks. All the equipment was massive and industrial grade, designed for colossal weight. But the hall was empty. There were no trainers, no wardens, and no music. There was only the hum of the air conditioners. In the far corner, the enormous electronic numbers of built-in medical scales with a wide steel platform glowed on the wall. Rudin walked over to the exercise machines. Want to stop? You have to feed the new ones. Were those the fat warden's words? That man had broken down. He reached some abstract line, perhaps 400 pounds, and begged for mercy. And the system gave him a windbreaker, a mask, and a raw tray of food, making him a slave forever, servicing the cogs of this giant incubator. But what if he didn't stop? What if the system wasn't testing physics, but will? In the greenhouse-like white halls, it broke dietary habits. On the stone staircase, it tested the survival instinct. On the mile-long ledge, it forced one to take a step beyond the limit. They drove him like cattle. They worked on their rules. They worked on their timers. They fed him from a shovel. Rudin looked at the tray of meat in his hand. His stomach responded with a demanding growl. The meat smelled divine. It was protein for a tormented body that had devoured its own muscles. He walked over to the nearest bench press. He carefully set the tray down. Then he shoved his hand into the pocket of his gray hospital pants and pulled out the 2.5 bananas he had saved on the cliff. He placed them next to the tray. He was at 570 pounds. That was minus 220 from his original weight. How much did he need to lose to navigate this labyrinth to the end? How much did he need to lose to walk through a door leading not to another sector, but to freedom, to Mark, to his wife, to his old life, but as a different person? He approached the steel platform of the scale. He stepped onto it with his bloody foot wraps. The red numbers on the display ran, registering his mass. 567.4. The forced march over the ocean had burned off almost 7 more pounds. Rudin stepped off the platform. He looked at the shard of basalt he still held in his hand. He slowly unclasped his bloody, numb fingers. The stone fell onto the rubberized floor of the gym with a dull thud. It was no longer needed. There was no one to fight here. The enemy was inside. "You wanted me to run after a piece of meat?" Rudin said hoarsely into the emptiness, looking into the lens of the camera under the ceiling. "I'm not playing by your rules anymore." He walked over to the bench. He tore the clear film on the tray with his teeth. He ate half the piece of boiled beef, just enough so his organism wouldn't collapse into a coma from protein starvation. He left the other half. He didn't touch the bananas. He turned on the treadmill to the lowest speed. He stepped onto it with feet wrapped in bloody fabric, and he started walking. He was without a walker. He was without a timer. He was without a command from the system. He was doing it himself. Time disappeared completely in the underground bunker. The days merged into one continuous, sweaty, bloody conveyor belt. Rudin created his own hell. It was a hell from which he had thrown out his self-pity. He started with walking. 10 minutes in, his heart banged in his ears like a bell. He lay down on the rubberized floor, gasping for air, waited for his pulse to drop, and got back on the belt. The food lay on the bench. He ate in tiny portions once a day. When the meat began to spoil and the bananas turned completely black, the system realized that the rules of the game had changed. A new tray slid out of the wall. It contained vitamin gel and a concentrated protein brick. It was a strictly rationed medical ration. It was exactly enough calories to keep his heart going, and not a gram more. They accepted his terms. He moved on to the iron. He lifted an empty barbell until his cramping muscles failed. He squatted, holding on to the racks, working out his torn meniscus time after time, forcing the joint to get used to the pain and ignore it. When the scale showed 400.0, he lost consciousness right on the platform. He woke up to a stream of cold air from the ventilation hitting his face. His organism screamed for a stop. That fat warden had broken down exactly here. 400 pounds was still an enormous weight, but it wasn't 800. It was a weight with which you could walk without shortness of breath, with which you could sit in a chair. It was a saving plateau. Rudin lay on the floor for an hour. Then he gritted his teeth, pushed himself up on his elbows, walked over to the barbell on the rack, and added 25 pounds to each side. His body changed terribly. The sagging skin, stripped of its fat frame, hung in coarse folds on his stomach and thighs, resembling an empty sack. His face became gaunt, stretching over his skull so tight that his cheekbones grew sharp, and his eyes sank deep into their sockets, burning from within with a fanatical, frightening fire. He had long ago tied his government-issue pants with a piece of some cable found behind an exercise machine to keep them from falling off. The wraps on his feet turned into stiff pieces of cardboard, black from dried blood and sweat, growing into the calloused skin of his soles. He was no longer a human being. He was a golem molded from pain and iron. Falling became a routine. He got on the elliptical, pedaled until the world collapsed into a gray dot, flew to the floor, smashing his face until it bled, spat, and climbed back on. Pain became his only conversationalist. Hunger became his trainer. At the end of the second month, according to his internal biological clock, since the system had stopped announcing the days, he approached the scale. His step was firm. It held not a drop of that clumsy, gelatinous heaviness with which he had started this journey in the White Ward. His thigh muscles, hidden beneath folds of excess skin, filled with a steely density. His back straightened. He stepped onto the metal platform. The red numbers flashed, selecting the exact weight. 264.0. Rudin looked at the display. 264 pounds. It was the genetic norm for a man of his height and bone width. There wasn't a gram of excess fat left on him. There were only muscles, dried out by dehydration and brutal workouts. and yards of skin that would never shrink back on its own. He had burned 530 pounds. He had destroyed 2 grown people inside himself. He had killed that weak, fat loser who had wanted to die in his pizza-stinking apartment. He waited. Absolute silence reigned in the gym. The air conditioners had shut off 10 minutes ago. Rudin stepped off the scale and stood in the middle of the hall, crossing his muscular arms, covered in scars from stones and falls, over his hollow chest. A dull click made him turn his head. The steel wall at the opposite end of the hall, which had seemed monolithic, slid apart softly and silently. There was no bright white corridor. There was no daylight from the ocean. There was a small room, similar to an airlock, and there was a metal pedestal. It was identical to hundreds of others in this damned labyrinth, but there was no food on it. A synthesized, even voice rang out from above, sounding not indifferent, but almost solemn. "Congratulations. You have successfully completed the therapy. Patient number 09. Baseline indicators are normal. You are ready for the next stage." The voice fell silent. Rudin walked toward the open airlock slowly, stamping out every step. There were no keys to the gates on the metal tray, nor a ticket to freedom. There were clothes lying there. There was a thick black windbreaker. There was a medical mask. And there were wide, very wide, to hide the folds of hanging skin, government-issue gray hospital pants. They were exactly the same as the ones on the warden. They were exactly the same as those worn by the mummified skeleton. Rudin stopped in front of the pedestal. The system wasn't treating people to return them to society. The system was producing perfect cogs for itself. He had proven his will by dropping 530 pounds, and now his reward was not freedom. His reward was a job vacancy. The next stage was stepping out onto a balcony with boiled meat for a new piece of biomass crawling along a ledge in the hope of a cure. Rudin looked at the black windbreaker. His eyes, sunken deep into his bony, haggard face, did not narrow with fear. There were no longer any tears of breakdown or submission in them. An icy flame burned in them. The flame of a man who had nothing left to lose. It was the flame of a man made of steel and basalt. End of Book 1.